Okay, we are here to talk about Washington Irving's story, Rip Van Winkle. Washington Irving was a writer and a bit of a jokester. As a young man, he created a magazine called Salmagundi with a bunch of his buddies, and it was a spoof of other writers and other events. And that marked his early career. He was also the guy who gave us the word Nix. He wrote under the pen name Diedrich Knickerbocker, and that name Knickerbocker has become synonymous with New York. You should think of the basketball team here. Anyway, Irving was well-traveled and wicked smart, and he wanted to write stories that were uniquely American. In his day, writers were mimicking British styles of writing. As a boy, though, he had spent some time in the Catskill Mountains because of an illness that had swept through New York, where he lived. And so he spent some time there, and what he loved most was all of the associations and legends of the original settlers, not the Native Americans, but the Dutch people who had bought land from the Native Americans. So this story, which most of you have read, is an homage to the legendary Catskill Mountains where Irving spent part of his childhood. But before we get to the story itself, we have an introduction which claims that the story is factual and that it is the research conducted by this imaginary writer called Diedrich Knickerbocker. It's interesting that Washington Irving has an unnamed editor who claims that the story is a factual account by a mysterious writer. Why so many barriers to the actual authorship? What's to be gained? Is it an elaborate joke? And why claim that the story is real when we know that it's impossible for someone to take a nap for 20 years? Anyway, we launch into the story and we find the setting to be a quaint, sleepy little town in upstate New York that was settled by the Dutch people. Everyone has a farm, everyone is prosperous and busy, except for Rip Van Winkle and his pals at the inn where they hang out and drink and chat about really not much of anything. Rip has a farm and children, but everything is ragged and worn down because he can't be bothered. What's interesting about the story, of course, the main thing that makes it so interesting is that Rip has a 20-year nap. He bowls with some little people and has some brew and immediately takes a nap, and then somehow 20 years go by. Spooky. When he comes down from the mountain, though, he notices that everything has changed. Everything is different. He's not sure how, but something dramatic has taken place during this nap. All of the new changes, of course, are due to the fact that the colony of New York has become the state of New York, and the 13 colonies have become a nation. Leave it to Rip Van Winkle. He slept through the American Revolution. So one thing the story does is to show the origins of the United States from the perspective of politics. When New York is a colony, nobody really cares much about politics. There's a life in the community, and lazy people like Rip are part of the community, but there's not really a lot of ambition or progress. It's just a quiet, respectful, sleepy place. It's not really the way de Krevker describes the colonies. Then, after the Revolutionary War, we see through Rip's eyes that the nation has gotten very busy. People have gathered to argue about politics and vote for representatives, and it's all very earnest business. So Rip reflects the old kind of thinking when the colonies didn't bother themselves with matters of government. His son, too, looks just like him, and the new village, the village after the revolution, doesn't really respect him. In fact, everyone can do without the young, lazy Rip. He doesn't represent what the nation has become. In a way, the story is an apology for the idea of progress. We Americans, we believe in progress, we work hard for it regularly, and that's a trademark of our nation. And it seems like that's something that identifies us as a nation. This story seems to, in a way, apologize for that. It ends with a mention of the spirit of the Native Americans who first populated the place and then disappeared. Then, too, the original settlers The Dutch settlers and their quiet way of doing things was also gotten rid of to make room for American ways of doing things. So the story's a bit wistful and nostalgic, but I think the tone suggests that everything worked out for the best. Americans are concerned with proper government. They take action when they feel that their rights have been trampled, and they work hard for themselves and their families. What we didn't really talk about here are the characters, the other characters around Rip Van Winkle, and how they might function as symbols in the story. As you read, keep an eye out for the characters and what they might represent. If the story is allegorical in a way, then it must have people and things that represent ideas. What about Rip's dog? What about Rip's hen-pecking wife? What about those bowlers and their casks of beer? And so on. Where do you see the symbols?